Good afternoon, everybody. It is Fertility Talk Live. It's Friday, and today we are joined by Robyn. Robyn is from the Wijnland Fertility Clinic. So thank you very much, Robyn, for joining us today.
You're welcome. Good to be
Great. And we are talking about fresh and frozen transfers, embryo transfers. And so anyone that's going through IVF treatment or is thinking about going through IVF treatment, this is would be quite a big topic and would be quite a big important question. So first of all, Robyn, you are from the Wijnland Fertility Clinic. Can you tell us more about yourself and what you do there?
So I'm one of the embryologists here. I started this year at Wijnland. There's three of us here. There's Cheyenne, there's Elsa, and myself. We're also a training institution, and Wijnland is the only clinic in South Africa that has the approach that we have, the holistic patient-centered approach. So I am really enjoying my time here, learning to do things a little bit differently. And it's really a great family to be part of. It's definitely place that is very warm and welcoming, and they do things very differently. So it's really a great place to be a part of.
That is awesome to hear. And we've only just heard great things about Wijnland. So thank you for that. So those of you, Wijnland is in Cape Town. It's out in the Winelands area, also a beautiful area. So if you're thinking of doing IVF or any type of fertility treatment, they are out in the Winelands area. You can contact us after the talk, or you can just pop us an email or pop Wijnland an email. I think it's info@wijnland.co.za. So the question today is, what is a fresh transfer? That is our first question. Is what is a fresh transfer?
Okay, so Leanne, the whole talk that you wanted to have is about fresh and frozen. So I thought I would just give a bit of background. The whole reason I think this has become a hot topic for patients is because there are a lot of clinics and a lot of doctors moving towards a freeze-all cycle. Okay, so a embryo transfer would then be when we do the stimulation, the follicles grow, we retrieve the eggs, and then we prepare the endometrium while the embryos grow in the lab, and we put them back 3 to 5 days later. Whereas if we weren't doing that part of putting them back, we would then be freezing the embryos and putting them back in a subsequent or a later cycle, sometimes even years later, depending on how the patient prefers to do it. Some people do embryo banking, and then we have a lot of embryos and we only put them back much, much later.
Okay. So what is the difference between the two, and why would you opt for the one rather than the other?
So a lot of the time, I think it's important to know that it's not necessarily making a choice yourself as the patient. I think it's important to know that your fertility specialist and your team that is looking after you has to make that decision when it comes to, increasing the chances of you falling pregnant, because that is what we want. Ultimately, we want a positive pregnancy result. So the difference between the two would obviously be going through one cycle, and then it may seem a lot more attractive because we have a shorter time to pregnancy, a shorter TTC, and then we can have our embryos back and hopefully fall pregnant. And I think a lot of patients, you feel quite anxious when you hear that you have to have your embryos frozen and that you'll have to wait another cycle. And then perhaps even in the next cycle after that, you make a cyst and then you have to wait even longer or something like that. So it can be a little bit frustrating, but there are reasons behind it. So it's not always choosing the patient self choosing, I want to have a fresh transfer, I want to have a frozen. There are definitely reasons for having either a fresh or a frozen transfer.
Okay. There's one question I haven't actually put on here that I think is actually very important is, can it cause freezing your eggs? Can it cause any damage to it? Would there be a difference? I think it might sound like a silly question, but I think it's something that women would actually ask. Would it damage the egg freezing it, or would there be something wrong with my baby if it was from a frozen embryo? Again, I said it sounds silly, but I think it is something they would ask.
No, Leanne, it's actually a brilliant question, and patients do ask it a lot of the time. I think worrying about the safety of your embryos is normal. And as the embryologist as well, that's our major concern, is the safety of your embryos. So with the latest freezing techniques, which is now vitrification, we have a more than 90% survival rate of the embryos, and that's worldwide. It's very rare that we see an embryo that didn't survive the warming process, and that would usually be due to factors like a poor embryo quality. So a lot of labs then decide that they will only freeze embryos of a certain grade in order to avoid the disappointment of having an embryo that doesn't survive a warming process, because then it either survives poorly or not at all. And with a poorly survived embryo, you have a much lower chance of pregnancy.
Oh, okay. And then what is the success rate of a frozen transfer? Or is it higher than with the fresh transfer or lower?
So that does differ a little bit from clinic to clinic. Here at Wijnland, our fresh and our frozen transfers are extremely comparable. There's no significant difference. We do sometimes see that the older women above 35 do a bit better with a frozen embryo transfer. Okay. It's not really a statistically significant amount better. And I think the biggest reason for that is because the stats that we're looking at over the last 3 to 5 years are already showing us where the doctors, the clinicians have been customizing cycles in order to give patients the best results. So when your doctor takes these millions of blood samples on different days of your cycle, and you always wonder, what now? What's happening now? What is this for? There are so many reasons for it. So on the day of pickup, we want to check what the progesterone is to make sure that the progesterone is low, so that we're not going to have a mismatched endometrium and embryo on the day of transfer. We then also check the progesterone again on the day of the transfer to make sure that it's high enough so that the supplementation we're giving you is working well. And if it isn't, then you will usually get additional progesterone. So, and it's been working like this for quite a while. It's nothing new. It's nothing specific to any clinic. It's information that everyone has and everyone knows about. So it's really the stats that we have. If we go look back at them, it's very difficult to see if there's either one or the other doing better, because we have already been doing this for patients, saying, look, we advise this way because we're sure that it will be better and it will give you a better chance.
Yeah. Great. Does Wijnland offer both fresh and frozen? Sorry.
Yes, absolutely. There are patients who, often we find patients with polycystic ovaries will need to have a freeze-all cycle. And now you can imagine that will be because there are many follicles developing, and there might be a greater effect on the uterus, and also that they have a possibility of hyperstimulation. And hyperstimulation, we know, is bad. We don't want that. And if you put an embryo back in a uterus where the patient is already hyperstimulated, you are quite likely going to do more damage, and she will end up not in a good way.
Yeah. Sorry.
So there are definitely options for both. It is like I'm trying to make very apparent to you, it is very important to always listen to the doctor and listen to the team. We do offer both. There are cycles where the fresh transfer is planned, but then at the time of embryo development, something is happening and the patient may start bleeding early, or the blood tests weren't optimal, and then it will be converted into a freeze-all cycle. So I think it's good to be flexible, because both have really great prospects. And I don't, a freeze-all cycle has its pros, but I think some of the cons could be that patients do get frustrated waiting, and that it's really a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah. What I'm really liking of what you're saying all the time as you're talking, you're actually considering the patient more, and not that, whether or not Wijnland is going to have the success. Is more about the patient, and you're constantly mentioning the patient and making sure that the patient gets the outcome that is best and stuff like that. So that is very nice.
I think it's important to note, the patient is our success.
Yeah.
So your success is our success.
That's awesome.
That's what it's about.
Yeah. Is there anything that we missed with regards to this?
You asked me, and I forgot to add it, about if there's any difference between babies born from fresh and frozen embryos. So there are some obstetric differences, but nothing that's really too concerning. So quite interestingly enough, we do find that babies born from frozen embryos weigh a little bit more. So they're a little bit heftier. It's not to say that they are overweight babies. It's just that they're a little bit bigger. And then there's also a study published that says, you know, frozen embryo babies are born slightly earlier than fresh embryo babies. And it's slightly as in 1 to 2 days a little bit earlier, which is really not going to make a difference to anyone. So there are things here and there, but there's nothing to say that when we vitrify the embryos that we are damaging them and in genetic abnormalities that were never there. That's definitely not the case. Vitrification has come a long, long way, but with slow freezing and all of that, so there's nothing that will change the genetics or create a potentially hazardous situation for the patient.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much for the talk, and you're taking your time out to do this talk today. It's been great as always. We've done a few talks before, normally on Instagram, and hopefully we'll have you on Instagram on the next one.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Have a great weekend, Robyn. Thanks.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Bye.